watch over us still,
even when the snows are deepest.
In the deep belly of winter, when the sky forgets the color of blue and the wind howls like a hungry wolf, the Viking lands fall into a silence so thick it smothers breath. Snow does not fall gently here, it descends like a siege. It piles high on thatched rooftops, sealing in families who haven't seen the sun in weeks. Frost laces the inside of the longhouse walls, and the air inside is just as biting as the air out. No smoke curls from the chimney. The fire is gone. Wood stores, long since consumed, have been reduced to splinters and ash. The forests are buried or unreachable, mountain passes are impassable, and the sea is a frozen mouth clamped shut. It is the 63rd day of snow, and still the cold deepens. In this silence, a child coughs. The old mutter in sleep. Every log once burned was a gamble on tomorrow. Now there are no more gambles, yet the people remain. Families don't scatter, they huddle closer. The walls of the longhouse aren't just wooden, they are woven with blood, sweat, and memory. This is not a tale of collapse, it is a tale of grit. The Viking world knew how to burn a flame, but they also knew how to become one. Beneath the animal pelts and frozen breath, there stirs something older than fire and instinct. And as the 64th day begins without warmth, the villagers open their eyes to a world still frozen and choose, once again, to survive. The fire didn't die in a single night. It starved slowly, shrinking from a steady blaze to a flicker, then to embers glowing faintly beneath cracked ash. Each log fed to the hearth was a decision: warmth now, or hope for later. The elders had warned of the early snowfall, but none could have predicted how swiftly the drifts would rise, or how ruthlessly the cold would seal off the outside world. The forest trails vanished under 6 feet of snow. Hunting parties returned empty-handed, frozen beards crusted with frost, their axes useless against trees encased in ice. The sleds that once carried bundles of pine now lay buried, forgotten. Trade routes to neighboring fjords were no longer roads but white deserts where footsteps vanished in moments. Inside the longhouse, the final pine logs were rationed with ceremony split into shards. Burned sparingly, the flames stretching thin over long nights. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, cloaked in furs, breathing in sync to conserve warmth. The fire wasn't just heat, it was light, time, and trust. When it faded, shadows returned. The elders whispered old songs to comfort children, their voices hoarse, their hands wrapped in sealed. The absence of flame became a test not just of survival, but of spirit. Outside, the snow didn't pause. It swallowed fences, buried fishing nets, silenced the howl of dogs. What was once a vibrant Viking settlement now appeared as a scattering of snow-covered mounds, silent, unmoving, forgotten by the world. And yet, within these mounds, life endured, not with roaring flames, but with the stubborn heartbeat of a people who had weathered more than winter. They did not wait for rescue. They became their own salvation. In Viking life, the hearth was more than a source of heat, it was the soul of the home. Its fire was sacred, a flickering presence watched over by gods and ancestors alike. Each spark cast onto the timber wasn't just combustion, it was communion. When a child was born, its first cradle was placed near the hearth. When someone died, their memory was honored with offerings burned in the flame. Loki, the trickster god of fire, was both feared and revered, while Freya, goddess of love and warmth, was often invoked during bitter winters. Fire was life, fire was lineage, fire was luck. And so, when the flame finally vanished, it felt like losing a family member. The longhouse dimmed. The gods seemed quiet. People whispered instead of speaking aloud, as if not to disturb the silence left behind. Some elders believed that a home without fire became vulnerable to spirits, and talismans carved with runes were hung near the hearth to ward off unseen cold dwellers. Women touched the blackened stones where the fire once lived and murmured charms to reignite luck. Children stared into the empty hearth, expecting it to flicker back to life with a prayer or a wish, but no miracle came. And still, the people endured. They shifted their rituals, burning dried herbs in clay bowls, drawing warmth from memory and myth. The hearth was not forgotten, it was carried differently now. Its warmth became symbolic, its spirit stored in songs, in stories, in the closeness of breath shared beneath woven blankets. Though the flame had died, the hearth still burned in their minds. A silent promise that when spring came, it would be reborn. And until then, they would keep the fire alive, not in wood but in will. As the nights grew longer and the cold more merciless, the Vikings turned to an ancient, primal warmth, the living heat of animals. In times of fireless desperation, the longhouse transformed into a sanctuary of breath and body. Cows were brought inside first, their massive forms radiating steady warmth, their slow exhales puffing clouds into the frigid air. Goats followed, restless and bleeding, yet vital. Chickens fluttered into corners. Dogs curled against human legs, and even the cat, normally aloof, nestled close to the soft belly of a sleeping child. The air inside grew thick with the scent of damp fur, manure, and sweat, but no one complained. Survival smells different in the absence of fire. Every heartbeat in that cramped space mattered. Bodies were not just companions, they were fuel. Parents slept with infants tucked beneath tunics, skin to skin, heart to heart. Couples lay pressed together, sharing not just warmth, but breath. Elders huddled against livestock flames, muttering thanks for the heat seeping through their bones. The walls, thick with sod and earth, held in every degree of life. Outside, the snowstorm raged with white fury. Inside, a different kind of fire burned. The temperature never rose much, but it was enough to stave off death. This intimate arrangement, ancient as humankind itself, was not born of convenience, it was instinct. They became a single living organism, pulsing with shared warmth and silent determination. In the absence of flame, they remembered, the body is its own furnace, and survival begins not with comfort, but with closeness. In those long nights, pressed against hide and heartbeat, the Vikings learned that sometimes the strongest fire is not lit with a spark, but with each other. The longhouse, often mistaken by outsiders as little more than a timber shack, was in truth a marvel of cold weather engineering, a structure not just built to endure winter, but to defy it. Its walls were thick with layers of turf and packed earth, stitched together with sod and moss that insulated like fur. Stones lined the base to trap heat, and the roof arched, steep, and blanketed with layers of thatch, bark, and more turf, was designed to shrug off snow while sealing in warmth. Within, the layout was deliberate, a single shared space with low ceilings to prevent heat from rising and escaping. Families slept side by side along wooden platforms, covered in animal skins and woolen blankets, forming a living tapestry of survival. Small slits in the walls allowed air to flow just enough to prevent suffocation, but not so much as to invite the cold. When fire was gone, these walls became their final line of defense. The architecture didn't just shelter them, it collaborated with them. Every breath stayed longer. Every shared meal warmed the air slightly. Every layered pelt nailed to the wall became part of the structure's skin. Even the floor, often lined with straw or woven mats, insulated against the cold earth below. There were no luxuries here, only choices made by necessity and honed by centuries of brutal winters. The longhouse was not a place of comfort, it was a fortress of breath and bone. And in these bitter weeks without fire, it became more than shelter. It was a womb, a cocoon, a final stand against the snow's silent siege. In this woven chamber of wood and will, the Vikings waited not for spring, but for the next breath. Without fire to cook or warm, the Viking diet transformed from sustenance to strategy. Food was no longer just about feeding the stomach, it was about fueling the body's furnace. High-fat meats became sacred. Seals, pigs, and salted lamb were hoarded like gold, their thick layers of fat converted by the body into slow-burning heat through a process now known as thermogenesis. Bone marrow, once a treat, became medicine dug out with knives and slurped straight from split femurs. Fermented fish, aged cheeses, and dried blood were rationed carefully, their pungent odors filling the longhouse air with the scent of survival. Meals were smaller, denser, and rich in calories. There was no waste. Even rendered animal fat was mixed with herbs and consumed in spoonfuls or spread on black rye bread like bitter butter. Children were taught early, eat not for taste, but for warmth. Elders knew which foods created heat and which merely passed through. Cold meats were warmed by placing them under armpits or near animal bellies before eating. Digestion itself became a sacred ritual. The slower you ate, the longer the heat would last. And in those frozen nights, warmth wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon. The body was their only stove, and every bite was kindling. While firewood had vanished, the Vikings learned to burn from within. It was a science of instinct nutrition shaped by centuries of frost and famine. And in their quiet chewing, wrapped in furs and silence, they told their bellies to endure. Spring would come, they promised themselves. But until then, they would eat like warriors, not of flame, but of fat, flesh, and fireless resolve. It was the great paradox of survival, using the very thing that threatened them to keep death at bay. Snow, which had buried their world and stolen the warmth of the sun, became their reluctant ally. The Vikings, masters of adaptation, began to manipulate the ice rather than fear it. Snow was no longer merely a prison, it became insulation. They packed it against the outer walls of the longhouse, sealing every crack with hardened frost, creating a thermal barrier against the wind. Extra rooms were abandoned, doors blocked off with snow bricks to conserve heat in smaller spaces. Some even dug out snow trenches beside the structure, fashioning windbreaks like frozen moats. Others built temporary snow shelters outside low domes shaped like half-igloos, used as caches or emergency rest areas when livestock needed tending. Within these, the stillness of the snow held body heat like a secret. Inside the longhouse, they sealed off drafts with snow-filled skins and made use of the bitter cold's consistency. Perishables were buried in the snow to preserve them longer, transforming nature's fuel into a refrigeration system. Snow also slowed decay at preserved animal hides, halted rot in meats, and allowed drying racks near windows to function despite the absence of smoke. By reshaping the snow, by treating it not as enemy but as material, they found control amid the chaos. Children helped, carrying buckets of packed flakes, shoveling trenches, shaping barriers. In their small hands, winter became malleable. And in the minds of their parents, a powerful truth crystallized. Survival meant learning the language of ice. The cold could not be beaten, but it could be bent. In the end, it was not the warmth of fire, but the shape of snow that protected them. When the last splinters of wood were gone, the Vikings turned to the ground beneath their boots and the refuse of their beasts. What could not be burned cleanly would burn raw. Dried animal dung collected, pressed, and left to harden became the new currency of fire. Women and children shoveled it by hand, shaping it into bricks and stacking it like sacred offerings. It smelled of hardship and smoked thick with bitterness, but it crackled with endurance. Mixed with straw or moss, it could smolder for hours, just enough to warm a stone or boil a bone broth. Alongside dung, they dug peat from frozen marshes, blocks of ancient moss and mud, compressed by time and water, though waterlogged and heavy when first unearthed. Peat dried slowly in the longhouse's stale air, emitting a sour odor as it cured. But when ignited, even a small peat brick glowed like an ember trapped in Earth's memory. Black smoke hung low in the rafters, staining timbers and throats, yet no one turned away. Smoke meant heat, however faint. Even seaweed, sun-dried in warmer months and curled into tight braids, found its way into the flames. Its burn was fast and foul, but it was fire. These makeshift fuels turned the hearth from a roaring blaze into a whispering coal bed, meager, pungent, but alive. The people learned to gather around the smallest flame, warming hands over smoke rather than flame, holding clay pots filled with hot stones to their chests at night. It was a compromise with nature's cruelty, warmth won by tenacity, not comfort. And in the choking hills of dung and peat, the Vikings rediscovered something essential: resilience isn't always glorious. Sometimes it just stinks, but it still burns. With fire scarce and fuel precious, even the act of preserving food had to evolve. The Vikings, long masters of the sea, turned to brine and salt, making the ocean their new flame. Without heat to smoke or cook their stores, they leaned on ancient methods: salt curing, ash packing, and fermentation. Barrels filled with layers of cod, seal meat, or venison were submerged in seawater mixed with ash or sour whey, forming a brine so potent that decay dared not enter. Meat was buried in snow-packed pits lined with sea salt, the earth becoming both freezer and guardian. These preservation methods didn't just fight rot, they enhanced flavor and fortified the body. Salty flesh helped retain water in the body, crucial in a time when dehydration from cold could creep unnoticed. Even in the dead of winter, nets were cast beneath frozen lakes, or through holes carved into ice-thick fjords. Whatever was pulled from the deep herring, flounder, mussels was immediately salted or fermented in earthen jars. Souring was not failure, it was survival. In warmer seasons, they dried strips of meat or fish on open racks. Now, in the absence of sun and flame, they relied on time, salt, and patience. Sour cabbage, fermented turnips, and pickled roots lined their shelves, not for taste, but for strength. Lactic acid and salt became their unseen allies, guardians of nourishment. The taste was harsh, the textures foreign, but no one complained. In this new world, food wasn't about pleasure, it was about preservation. They were not dining, they were enduring. Each bite, salted and sour, was a promise. We will eat again, we will survive the snow, and when the thaw comes, our hands will still hold strength. In the deepest nights, when even the breath of livestock faded into stillness, the Vikings turned inward to belief, to myth, to the invisible warmth of their gods. Fire may have vanished from the hearth, but it still burned in their rituals. Runes were etched not for beauty, but for survival symbols carved into bone or bark, invoking Thor's protection or summoning Freyr's blessings of endurance. Small stones, warmed by body heat, were tucked into wool pouches and marked with sacred signs. Talismans kissed before sleep and gripped tight when the wind howled through the rafters. The flame had left their hearth, but they lit candles in their minds, kindled through prayer, chants, and whispered stories of Ragnarok, where even gods faced darkness and fought to return the light. Families gathered in dim circles, eyes reflecting firelight, remembered rather than seen. Mothers told tales of Surt, the fire giant, not as destroyer, but as reminder. Fire always returns. Children repeated verses under their breath like spells, each syllable a spark against despair. And in the minds of the old, memory became a firewood of its own. They recalled winters harsher than this, when wolves howled closer and yet the village still stood. These stories, passed between frostbitten lips, became insulation for the soul. The gods were not distant here. In the silence, they listened. Faith was not shouted. It was breathed into bone, woven into wool, tucked behind eyes that refused to close. In these rituals, no wood was burned, no flame danced, but something ignited, not in the hearth, but in the heart. For even in the coldest world, belief burns hotter than fear. And so, they prayed not for fire, but for the strength to endure without it. As the winter pressed on like a suffocating weight, the Vikings embraced a rhythm older than memory, a hibernation of the human spirit. With no fire to chase away the chill, time itself began to bend. Days dissolved into twilight. Nights stretched endlessly, and within the longhouse, movement slowed to a crawl. Sleep was no longer a nighttime ritual, it was survival. Families began to sleep in shifts that blurred day and night, bundling together beneath layers of pelts, using each other's breath as a lullaby. Some slept 12, even 16 hours, their bodies conserving every calorie, every spark of energy. Children were taught to still their limbs, to let the cold pass over them like water over stone. Talking less, moving less, every gesture measured, every word weighed. Elders would say, "The bear lives because he sleeps." And so they too adopted the bear's wisdom. Even thoughts were quieter, turned inward, gentle. Activity was rationed like food. Tasks that once filled the day, mending, carving, combing wool, were now performed in mere silence, hands moving slowly to keep from trembling. The longhouse became a temple of stillness. Outside, the snow whispered through the trees, blanketing the world in hush. Inside, hearts beat like distant drums, soft and patient. There were no feasts, no games, no clanging axes, only the steady breath of a people waiting. And in that waiting, something sacred stood. They did not fear the stillness. They leaned into it. Like the earth beneath them, they went dormant. Not dead, not defeated, just waiting for the thaw. It was not weakness, but wisdom. For those who live in the cold know sometimes, to survive the storm, You must let your soul sleep with the season. In the absence of fire, invention became their fiercest weapon. The Vikings, shaped by generations of hardship, were not strangers to making do, but now they would craft warmth without flame. Stones, once used to ring the hearth, were repurposed, heated briefly by the smallest ember or a chunk of smoldering peat, then wrapped in thick cloth and tucked into beds, cradled like infants through the night. Animal fat, harvested from preserved stores, was poured into hollowed-out horns or clay cups, with a simple wick of twisted flax crude, flickering candles that cast more hope than heat. Sealskin cloaks, once reserved for sea journeys, were worn indoors, layered atop wool and lined with moss for insulation. Even their tools, adapted bone hooks, were fashioned to melt small chunks of snow in suspended bags, yielding drinkable water without flame. Children learned to shape snowshoes and insulated foot wraps from hide and straw, ensuring that those who dared step outside would return with toes intact. The longhouse itself became a machine of efficiency: windows sealed with ice, gaps plugged with mud and cloth. The smallest heat source was treated like treasure. Even body waste was strategically relocated to reduce interior chill. Innovation wasn't grand, it was granular. A new way to stitch furs tighter, a new knot to fasten a cloak, a better way to share breath beneath a single blanket. These were the inventions of necessity, the science of the suffering. And through it all, the people whispered no complaints. For each small adaptation was a rebellion against extinction, a quiet declaration that they would not be undone by cold. In a world of frost, they found their fire not in flame, but in the brilliance of hands, minds, and will. In the heart of that endless winter, it was the children who reminded the village what endurance truly looked like. Born into cold, they knew no other world, and so they adapted without protest. Their feet were calloused by frozen floors, their cheeks windburned and ruddy, their laughter muffled but never fully gone. Boys no older than 10 learned to trap hares and gutfish with trembling fingers. Girls stitched sealskin mittens and chewed sinew into thread, mimicking their mothers with quiet precision. They played in short bursts, mock battles with icicles as swords, snow forts built into the drifts beside the longhouse walls. But even play was work. Every movement burned calories. Every noise risked waking the sleeping or startling the livestock huddled within. So they learned to be silent hunters, patient watchers, alert to their world without being ruled by it. Their education was not one of books, it was fireless survival, taught by gesture and grit. They memorized the signs of frostbite on a sibling's nose, the sound of a goat in distress, the feel of a floor growing too cold from underneath signaling snowmelt, or worse. And when a baby cried in the night, it was often an older child who pressed close, offering warmth not as a signal, but as a sentinel. The longhouse watched them grow, not in comfort, but in resilience. Their innocence was hardened, but not broken. For in every child's eye was the quiet, shining truth of their people. Strength born not from rage, but from rhythm. These children of ice and iron would carry forward the lessons carved by snow, lessons that no fire could teach. And in their small, shivering hands, the future smoldered. Then, one morning, just as the sky began to shift from deep gray to the faintest shade of blue, a thin ribbon of smoke curled above the ridge. Not from the longhouse, but from beyond the tree line. A young hunter had returned. His sled dragged behind him not just meat, but a miracle: driftwood, salt, bleached and sea-tossed. The gray planks were brittle, waterlogged, but they were burnable. And tucked deep in his satchel, wrapped in wool and ash, was something even rarer of coal. Carried from a distant settlement, kept alive for days, protected as if it were a child. The village gathered without a word, hearts pounding louder than their steps. In the dead hearth, the coal was placed gently, reverently. Dried dung, peat crumbs, and scraps of cloth were layered atop it with shaking hands. A breath, another. Then, the faintest glow. It flickered, shuddered, and then, at last, flame. Thin and golden, it licked the air like a whisper from the gods. A collective breath escaped the longhouse, as if the people had been holding it for 100 days. Faces turned toward the light, eyes wet not from smoke, but from something deeper. The fire did not roar, it hummed, and that was enough. Children leaned close, blinking at the warmth as if meeting an old friend. Elders closed their eyes, hands outstretched. For the first time in months, the cold was pushed back, not much, but enough to remember what it meant to feel. The longhouse sighed. Above them, the sky cracked open slightly, and for a moment, sunlight touched the snow. Fire had returned, but so had hope. In the end, it wasn't the fire that saved them, it was everything they did without it. The Vikings endured not because of the flame, but because of what burned within, the ingenuity to shape earth into shelter, the strength to draw warmth from one another, the instinct to turn hunger into ritual and silence into song. They didn't just survive the snow, they absorbed it, molded it, used it as both shield and teacher. The longhouse had become more than timber and turf. It had become a crucible, forging their patience, their endurance, their identity. When spring's first thaw crept across the fjords, when birds returned to naked trees and the sun dared linger past midday, they didn't erupt in celebration. They simply opened the doors, stepped into the melting world, and kept working. They hauled peat with practiced hands, chopped driftwood like it was sacred, and carried children who had grown wiser in the dark. The memory of the cold would stay not as a scar, but as a story. A story not of defeat, but of adaptation. Not of waiting for rescue, but of building it from bone, belief, and breath. The fire was back, yes, but what mattered more was that it had never truly left. It had been kept alive in every shared blanket, every salty meal, every quiet prayer whispered into fur-lined darkness. Because for the Vikings, survival was never about the flame. It was about the fire within.